Have you ever, walked over to your kitchen sink, filled a glass with tap water, and just stood there worrying about the exact concentration of chlorine in it?
Probably not. I mean, nobody really does that.
Right, and more importantly, you've never been asked to cast a vote on it. You don't see politicians holding rallies to debate whether the municipal chlorine level should be, 1 part per million or 3 parts per million.
No, absolutely not. Nobody treats the safety of our drinking water as a matter of personal opinion or political ideology. The correct level of chlorine is just computed,
Yeah, compute it.
right? The Environmental Protection Agency uses epidemiology, chemistry, toxicology. They run the math to perfectly balance the elimination of dangerous pathogens against the risk of creating carcinogenic byproducts. They publish the number, and municipalities just implement it.
Which is wild when you think about it, because if a politician stood up at a town hall and said, my constituents feel in their hearts that the chlorine level should be lower, they would be laughed right out of the room. We all just accept that this is an engineering problem.
Exactly.
But now I want you to take that phrase, chlorine level, and substitute it with immigration level, or education spending, or the eligibility age for receiving a pension.
Oh yeah, the entire atmosphere in the room changes instantly.
Suddenly, the math gets thrown completely out the window, and we are in this fierce ideological war. One side is screaming about compassion, the other is shouting about fiscal responsibility. You've got pundits yelling on television, elections turning on these single issues, but nobody's actually computing the answer.
Nobody at all.
Why? Why is water treatment an engineering problem, but immigration or pension policy is a blood sport?
That is the exact question at the heart of today's deep dive. We're looking at a really fascinating essay by Elias Kunis called Calculemus. And the core premise here is just startling. Kunis argues that most of our fiercest policy disagreements are not actually clashes of deeply held values.
Right, which is what we always assume they are.
Right. But he's saying they're just uncomputed engineering problems, and we as a society are systematically avoiding the math.
Which is such a crazy thought. We have a great stack of sources today to help us dig into this, including Brian Kaplan's research on voter behavior, the Dartmouth Atlas of Healthcare, and some pretty wild historical case studies.
Very wild case studies, yeah.
Now, before we dive in, just a quick note to you listening. Our sources today touch on some politically charged history. We're going to talk about Richard Nixon, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, Augusto Pinochet, Keynesian economics, welfare policies, you name it. To be incredibly clear, we are not taking sides or endorsing any political viewpoints here.
Right. We're strictly and impartially reporting the arguments laid down in the author's essay and the historical case studies provided. We're just here to convey the ideas so you can explore them for yourself.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the immediate reaction most people have to the phrase, we can compute policy, is that it sounds like, I don't know, science fiction.
Like a dystopia, yeah.
Like we're going to hand the government over to a giant supercomputer. But Kunis points out that we already do this. We calculate policy all the time.
We do. What's fascinating here is that we already compute policy in every single domain where getting the answer wrong kills people fast enough to create immediate political consequences.
Purpose enough, yeah.
Think about aviation safety. For decades, plane crashes were investigated reactively. They waited for a tragedy, and then they tried to fix whatever broke. But eventually, the FAA and the Commercial Aviation Safety Team, they shifted to prognostic risk computation.
Wait, that sounds like heavy academic jargon. What is prognostic risk computation in plain English?
Oh, right. It just means looking at near misses and system data to calculate future probabilities instead of, waiting for blood on the runway. They stopped debating and started calculating acceptable risk. Runway safety areas, for example, they are mathematically dimensioned to cover 90% of overrun scenarios.
And the result of that math was an 83% reduction in commercial aviation fatality risk between 1998 and 2008. I mean, the math clearly works.
It works perfectly. And we saw the exact same transition in pharmaceuticals. Before 1962, whether a drug worked or not was largely a matter of a physician's personal opinion or their clinical intuition.
Which seems insane now.
It does. But then the thalidomide disaster happened. That catastrophe triggered the Kefauver-Harris Amendment in the United States, which legally subordinated a doctor's opinion to double-blind biostatistics.
So the question of drug efficacy went from an art form to a rigorous computation.
Exactly.
We even see it in things like monetary policy and building codes. Before Paul Volcker came along, interest rates were highly vulnerable to political pressure. You had Richard Nixon leaning heavily on Fed Chairman Arthur Burns to keep interest rates low right before the 1972 election.
Right, and Burns gave in.
He gave in, and the result was the massive stagflation of the 1970s. The fix for that was the Taylor rule, basically computing interest rates from macroeconomic data and giving central banks independence to insulate that math from politicians.
And if you want to see what happens when you reverse that process, just look at Turkey recently. President Erdogan fired the central bank governors, decided to set interest rates based on his own personal theories instead of the math, and watched the currency completely collapse.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Or look at building codes. A city council cannot vote to repeal the laws of physics. The acceptable load on a beam or the seismic rating of a foundation, those are computations, forged by the undeniable catastrophes of earthquakes and fires.
So we have these two buckets, the bucket of things we compute, like airplane safety and building codes, and the bucket of things we vote on and argue about, like fiscal policy and the economy. But hold on. Isn't managing a multi-trillion-dollar economy fundamentally harder to compute than the wing stress tolerance on an airplane? Isn't the boundary just about how technical the subject is?
That is the standard assumption, yeah. But Kunis argues it's completely wrong. The boundary between what we compute and what we vote on is not about whether a domain is technical or political.
Then what is it?
The boundary is temporal. It is entirely about the speed of the feedback loop.
The speed of the feedback loop. Let's dig into that.
Well, aviation involves millions of interacting components, unpredictable weather, human psychology. I mean, it is incredibly complex. But when the aviation math fails, a plane falls out of the sky, and it's on the evening news in hours. The feedback is instant, and crucially, that instant catastrophe completely resolves the dispute over the objective function.
Meaning what we are trying to optimize for, like before a crash, airlines might be arguing over optimizing for faster turnaround times versus passenger comfort versus fuel costs.
Exactly.
But the moment a plane crashes, everyone instantly agrees on the objective function. Don't crash.
Don't crash. Right. Now look at fiscal policy. The math there, revenue, demographics, debt dynamics, it is arguably much less complex than the aerodynamics of a commercial jet.
Really? Less complex?
Mathematically, yes. But when fiscal math fails, the plane doesn't drop out of the sky on the evening news. The failure arrives 40 years later as below replacement fertility or crumbling infrastructure or a pension fund just running out of money. The physics of the failure is patient.
Patient physics, that's a great way to put it.
Because the consequences are delayed by decades. No politician currently in office bears the cost. They will be long gone. Because the feedback loop is slow, politicians opine instead of computing.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because the ultimate excuse for why we don't compute these slow-moving problems is, well, we just have different values. It's the ultimate conversational trump card.
Oh, absolutely.
If you and I are arguing about healthcare or taxes, and I say, you can't put a number on human dignity, we just have different values, the conversation is over. I've taken it out of the realm of math and put it into the realm of tribal loyalty.
It is an incredibly effective defense mechanism. But the essay breaks down empirical proof that voters don't actually have fundamentally different values. Everyone generally wants the same things: prosperity, safety, health, stability. What we actually have are different empirical models of how cause and effect work.
Yeah, the source material brings up economist Brian Kaplan's research on this. He analyzed surveys where voters and PhD economists were asked identical empirical questions. Not moral questions like, what should we do, but mechanical questions like, what would happen if we did X?
Right. And what did he find?
He found that voters and economists hold exactly the same values regarding wanting a prosperous society. But voters hold systematically biased empirical models about the mechanisms of how things like trade or unemployment actually function.
Which is fascinating. And we see this proven out in James Fishkin's deliberative polls, too. In these experiments, researchers take a representative sample of regular citizens who hold wildly polarized, seemingly incompatible political views.
People who you'd think would never agree on anything.
Right. They put them in a room, give them balanced expert data, and let them question specialists. The result, and this is replicated globally across dozens of experiments, is that polarization drops massively. Their preferences actually converge.
Wow.
It turns out what looked like an insurmountable clash of core values was actually just information asymmetry.
Yeah.
When citizens share a factual model of reality, they largely agree on what the policy should be.
I love the medical example the author gives here, too. The Dartmouth Atlas, driven by researcher John Wenberg, documented massive regional variations in how medical procedures were done across the country.
Hmm.
Doctors were arguing fiercely over these differences.
Yeah, big debates in the medical community.
But then health economist Charles Phelps looked at this and proved they weren't arguing about the value of human life or different patient values. They were just having a disagreement over the production function, meaning they literally just disagreed on the empirical data of which treatments mechanically worked best. But when that mechanical disagreement leaked into the public sphere, it immediately got moralized into a dramatic debate about the sanctity of life.
Which totally derails the actual math problem.
Exactly. But if that's true, if these are really just math problems and production functions disguised as culture wars, why don't we just solve them? Are you saying politicians are consciously deceiving us? Like, is this some massive conspiracy?
No, it's not a conscious conspiracy. It's more like a civilizational immune system. Sociologist Lindsay McGoey calls it strategic ignorance.
Strategic ignorance.
When computing an answer would reveal that a current policy only serves incumbent interests rather than its stated purpose, the system protects itself. It invokes that values are subjective argument to provide axiological camouflage for bad math.
Hold on. Axiological camouflage, what does that actually mean?
Sorry, right? Axiology is the study of value and morals. So axiological camouflage basically means using moral values as a smokescreen to hide terrible math.
Oh, I see.
If you keep the question in the realm of values, you ensure the actual math is never run. And the people currently benefiting from the broken system get to keep their power.
And the historical track record of people trying to run the math anyway is pretty bleak. It's a graveyard of terminated projects. Look at the Soviet Union in the 1960s. Soviet mathematicians designed OGAS, which was meant to be a nationwide real-time computer network for economic planning.
Oh yeah, OGAS.
The math was sound, the technology was feasible, but Soviet bureaucrats killed it. They didn't argue with the math, they just starved the project of funding. Why? Because computing the economy in real time would have made all their corrupt patronage networks entirely transparent.
They couldn't have that. And the exact same thing happened in Chile in the 1970s with Project Cybersyn. Stafford Beer built this incredible cybernetic network linking factories to a central coordination hub.
This is the one with the telex machines, right?
Yeah, they used telex machines to send real-time data back and forth. And during a massive trucker strike in 1972, the system actually worked. It processed thousands of telex messages a day to coordinate the distribution of essential goods around the blockade.
That's amazing for the 1970s.
It was. But it was destroyed during Pinochet's coup in 1973. It wasn't destroyed because the computation failed. It was collateral damage in a political upheaval.
Perhaps the most insidious example of strategic ignorance is how we measure the global economy itself. When Simon Kuznets presented the concept of national income accounts to the U.S. Senate in 1934, he explicitly warned them, do not use this as a measure of national welfare.
He literally said, don't do it.
But Keynesian economists adopted his framework, created GDP, and made a critical, deliberate choice. They included government spending in the aggregate number.
Which changes everything.
Let me make sure I understand this.
Yeah.
By that definition, if the government taxes people and uses that money to pay a crew to dig a giant hole in the ground and then pays them to fill it back up, the GDP goes up.
It absolutely goes up. It's a metric that rewards state spending by its very construction. It mechanically justifies the state expanding its own power. And that metric was hardwired into the IMF, the World Bank, and every central bank mandate on Earth.
That is wild.
For 80 years, we've had beyond GDP initiatives trying to measure actual well-being, but they are systematically bypassed when budgets are drawn. The incumbent power structure benefits from the opacity of the current math.
Okay, so let's say we accept this. We should compute policy. But how do we do that without becoming a dystopian central planning state? Because there are very legitimate critics of this kind of thinking. You have Friedrich Hayek, who correctly pointed out that you cannot centralize all the distributed tacit knowledge of millions of people in a market.
Right, a central planner simply cannot know enough.
And you have James C. Scott, who warned against high modernist legible grids. Actually, before we move on, what exactly does Scott mean by high modernist legible grids?
He's talking about the arrogance of central planners trying to force messy, organic human reality into neat, rigid spreadsheets. Think of urban renewal projects that bulldoze historic neighborhoods to build perfectly symmetrical concrete high-rises.
Ah, okay.
In trying to make a community mathematically legible, From a top-down view, they usually destroy the very social fabric that keeps the community alive.
Those are crucial warnings. So how does Elias Kunis suggest we compute policy without falling into those traps?
Well, Kunis argues that the mechanist version of Calculemus, this idea of computing policy, it does not require a central planner. It requires three specific things. First, an explicit objective function.
Okay.
A bridge engineer can't compute beam dimensions without knowing the required load. A governance engineer needs an objective function. Kunis suggests this shouldn't be a politically negotiated preference, but a physics-derived constraint. Sustained civilizational flourishing over deep time.
Basically, the objective is survive and thrive over the long term without destroying the foundation for the next generation.
Exactly. Second, it requires designed architecture, not central planning. We don't need a dictator making choices. We need mechanisms like prediction markets. Markets already compute distributed knowledge into prices.
Right.
Prediction markets can compute the probability that a specific policy will achieve a specific outcome, utilizing the decentralized knowledge of participants who actually have skin in the game, but someone has to design the rules of that market.
Which leads to the third requirement, which is the wildest part of the essay, the fourth branch of government, a mechanism authority. Now, if I'm listening to this, I'm thinking, doesn't this mechanism authority just sound like a shadow government of unelected nerds overriding the democratic will of the people?
I get that fear. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, it's vital to understand that this fourth branch's power is purely informational, not executive. They cannot write laws, they cannot block legislation. They act as a cybernetic governor for the system.
Let's ground this for the listener. Imagine your local city council is voting on a major new zoning law. Under this system, before the vote happens, the mechanism authority runs a formal audit. They run the math and ask, how will rational people game this rule?
Yes, exactly.
Let's say their computation shows the zoning law will inevitably cause a massive housing shortage in 10 years.
The authority publishes that math. The city council still gets to vote. The democracy remains intact. But if the council wants to pass the zoning law anyway, they are forced to pass a public override resolution. They have to put their names on the record saying, we see the math that this policy will cause a housing crisis, and we are choosing to ignore it.
Wow, so ignoring the computation isn't illegal, but it becomes politically very expensive.
Highly expensive.
And we actually have a real-world proof of concept for this. In 2015, Wales passed the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. They created an independent commissioner with actual statutory power to intervene in government decisions.
Yeah, this is a great example.
In 2019, the government wanted to build the M4 Relief Road, a £1.1 billion project that traditional GDP math completely supported because it would stimulate the economy in the short term.
But the commissioner used their legal standing to step in. They submitted evidence showing that the road violated long-term sustainability requirements. They ran the full ledger on environmental impact, future maintenance, and ecological degradation.
And because the commissioner had statutory veto power, forcing the decision-maker to confront that math on the public record, the massive billion-pound project was killed.
Informational power with legal architecture actually changes outcomes. Decades of advisory dashboards produce nothing but ignored reports. But forcing politicians to hit the override button in front of everyone actually work.
But computation isn't a magic wand, though. The essay is very clear that if you apply the math poorly, it fails horribly. Calculemus has two major failure modes. The first is computing the wrong thing.
Right. Look at Philip Tetlock's existential risk persuasion turn-in. He gathered super forecasters and domain experts, gave them shared data and financial incentives, and asked them to compute the probability of AI causing human extinction by the year 2100.
And they completely failed to converge. The domain experts estimated a 3% chance of extinction, and the super forecasters estimated a 0.38% chance. Even with all the data and incentives, they couldn't agree.
Because they were trying to compute an 80-year horizon where physical feedback is impossible. Without a fast feedback loop, human cognition just calcifies back into tribal positions. The lesson there is when a long-term outcome is uncomputable, you stop trying to predict the horizon.
You shift to computing present-day incentive architectures.
Exactly. We can't compute AI in 2100, but we can compute exactly how current liability regimes and insurance policies alter the payoff matrix for AI labs today.
Makes sense. The second failure mode is even more dangerous, computing without feedback. The prime example in our sources is Australia's robo-debt disaster. The government used an automated system to recover welfare debts, but the algorithm was fundamentally flawed. It averaged people's annual income across 2-week periods.
Let's look at how that actually worked in practice. Imagine you are a precarious worker. You are completely unemployed for 10 months out of the year, zero income. Then you get a grueling seasonal job and work double shifts for 2 months.
Okay.
The algorithm simply took that 2-month burst of income, averaged it out across the entire year as if you made that steady paycheck every 2 weeks, and falsely concluded you were overpaid welfare benefits during the months you had absolutely nothing.
Which is just terrible math. The engineering was bad, resulting in hundreds of thousands of false positive debt notices. But the true disaster was architectural. The system was given executive authority to mandate debt recovery without any human review. People couldn't even get a human on the phone to explain the math was wrong.
No human in the loop at all.
So, what does this all mean? It's like building a self-driving car but taking out the steering wheel, removing the brake pedal, and painting the windshield black. The problem wasn't just that the algorithm made a mistake. The catastrophic problem was giving it the power to execute decisions with zero human error correction.
It was a disaster.
There was no feedback loop to catch the mistake before it ruined lives, ultimately resulting in a massive $1.2 billion settlement.
This raises an important question about how we implement computation. Computation absolutely requires error correction. Every model is going to be wrong at the margins. The point of the fourth branch, the point of the cybernetic governor, is to catch those errors quickly.
Right.
Standard policy works with standard modeling. But as uncertainty grows, we must use probabilistic computation. We compute the best current estimate, measure the trailing indicators, and constantly adjust as the error bars shrink.
To pull all of this together, the core takeaway of Calculemus and the surrounding research is that in the domains still governed by opinion, things like demographic planning, education, pension solvency, we are accumulating invisible catastrophes.
Invisible because they're slow.
Because the feedback loop takes decades, politicians are structurally incentivized to ignore the math, depleting our civilizational capital without triggering any immediate alarms.
The price of not computing is slow decay. But as Kunis writes, approximately right beats precisely zero.
Approximately right beats precisely zero.
Any honest, rough computation is better than the zero governance we use when we hide behind the mask of different values. The math is available, the institutional architecture to protect it is known. We just have to stop letting strategic ignorance win.
Before we wrap up, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over. We've been talking about civilizational scales and government branches, but let's bring it down to the personal level.
Oh, I like this.
Imagine if you had a personal fourth branch in your own life. An uncompromising, unignorable ledger tracking the slow, decades-long consequences of your daily choices, your health, your relationships, your personal finances.
Like a personal cybernetic governor.
Exactly. Imagine if every time you decided to skip the gym or max out a credit card on something you didn't need, this personal ledger forced you to hit an override button on a public record, acknowledging the exact mathematical cost to your future self.
That would be brutal.
It would be. But it makes you wonder, how many of your deeply held personal values or so-called lifestyle choices would turn out to just be strategic ignorance of your own bad habits?
That is quite the thought experiment.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the underlying mechanics of how we run our world. We'll catch you next time.